Hello, my name is Will Hull, and this will be Unit 2 for California for Division C hearing for the We the People National Finals. In a moment, I will have the judges introduce themselves, followed by the students, and then we will begin the hearing. Students will deliver a 4-minute prepared statement, followed by 8 minutes of judge questions. My microphone will be muted during the hearing, and I will be holding up the 1-minute sign and the time sign. And the teacher has explicitly asked for me to call out when it's time. So I will do that at the end of the both periods. And I suggest that the students or everybody in the room use the gallery view up in your top right-hand corner of Zoom. You can click on the view to change it to gallery. And at the conclusion of the hearing, the judges will give some brief feedback and then we will conclude. At this time, I will go ahead and let the judges introduce themselves.
Great. I'm going to introduce myself first, then my co-judges will introduce themselves, and then if you could introduce yourselves to us, that would be great. And then we will let you know which question you will be answering, and then we'll read that question to you in full. I am Julie Silverbrook. I'm the Senior Director of Partnerships and Constitutional Scholar in Residence at iCivics.
Good morning. My name is Tim Igo. I am, in no particular order, a writer, magazine editor, and lawyer, and happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Nick Drummond. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Black Hills University in South Dakota.
Great. Now you guys can go ahead and introduce yourselves to us.
No problem. Hi, we're Irvington High School's Unit 2. I'm Orion Fang.
I'm Frederick Xiong.
And I'm Geetika Yelagoti, and we'd like to thank the judges and the facilitator, as well as our coach, Mr. Martinez.
Thank you. Now, what I know you've been waiting for, the question you'll be answering this morning is question 1, which I will now read to you in full. What were the major disagreements among the 55 delegates during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and how were they resolved? What issues, if any, were not resolved, and what were the consequences? What changes, if any, should be made to the Constitution? You may begin your answer as soon as you are ready.
Addressing the Constitutional Convention delegates, Benjamin Franklin said both sides must part with some of their demands in order that they may join some accommodating proposition. The convention's compromises over the issues of representation, term limits, and the electoral process laid the foundations of our government today.
Among the most divisive issues was representation. Larger states backed James Madison's Virginia plan, while smaller states rallied behind William Patterson's New Jersey plan. Eventually, the Grand Committee brokered the Great Compromise, which created a bicameral system that would have a proportionally represented lower house and an equally represented upper house.
Slave representation was another contentious issue. Since Southerners were to be taxed for owning slaves, they wanted slaves to count towards representation. Northerners objected, since slaves had no say in the selection of representatives. Both sides were eventually appeased by the 3/5 compromise.
The delegates also disagreed on term lengths for the presidential position. A majority favored a single 7-year term, but both Madison and Wilson objected, believing that such a term was too long and powerful. The Committee of Postponed Matters ultimately shortened the 7-year term to 4 years, but allowed the presidents to run for re-election.
The means of electing the president were also heavily debated. James Wilson called for a direct popular vote, while Roger Sherman wanted Congress to elect the president. Though it garnered little support upon introduction, in the end, the Electoral College was chosen as a compromise between the two by the Committee of Detail.
Despite the compromises that were made, however, the delegates left many issues unresolved, chief amongst them citizenship, state sovereignty, and judicial power. Though both Federalists and Anti-Federalists agreed on the importance of the issue, citizenship was never truly resolved. Federalist 42 argued for a uniform process since it would stabilize the Union, but Federal Farmer 18 disagreed, since such a process would intrude on state sovereignty. Because the matter was unresolved, the process was left to the states until the Civil War amendments, leading to a fully nationalized process of obtaining U.S. citizenship.
Another issue was a system of federalism created. Questions regarding the extent of federal power and state sovereignty have remained a persistent issue throughout American history. They led to the first and second party systems, played a major role in the Civil War, and had maintained an adversarial two-party system to this date.
Finally, the framers never fully finished the judiciary. Though the Supreme Court was established and given the power of judicial review, Article 3 did not define finer details of the court's powers. As a result, the court was forced to define its own powers and restrictions through the cases brought to it, resulting in its expansive power to determine the constitutionality of law today. Anti-federalists such as Brutus viewed this lack of detail as a flaw, since the court appeared in Brutus 15 independent of the people, the legislature, and of every power under heaven.
Though the time of the framing has long passed, no institution is perfect. We believe that in order to further expand democracy, the Constitution should be changed to abolish the Electoral College and institute judiciary term limits.
The Electoral College dilutes the votes of citizens in larger states. Since states are guaranteed at least 3 electors each regardless of size, smaller states that only make up 4% of the total population are given 8% of Electoral College votes. Thus, the Electoral College should be abolished in favor of the direct popular vote.
Due to the nature of Supreme Court appointments, the institution has become increasingly unresponsive to the public view in recent years, as justices are allowed to remain on courts decades after appointment. The implementation of staggered term limits would create a regular appointment process, which would allow for the court to become a more democratic body able to reflect the will of the people today. Thank you, and we're ready for your questions now.
Great, thank you so much. So you have put forth some reform proposals on the judicial branch, and I wanted to ask, what are the existing constitutional checks on judicial power?
One of the existing checks, though not necessarily explicitly defined, is of course the congressional power to make legislation. Though the Supreme Court can indeed strike down legislation it deems unconstitutional, Congress has the power to circumvent that by in turn making more legislation that accords with the demands of the Supreme Court. For example, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution is an example of an amendment passed to circumvent the Supreme Court's decision of the Dred Scott case.
Another check on the judicial branch is that justices will remain in their positions in times of good behavior. So only when justices are within the bounds of their judiciability are they able to stay on the courts.
Okay, thank you. I'll invite one of my other judges to pose some questions as well.
Thank you for your presentation. So you briefly mentioned term limits in your presentation. And I'm going to ask you to dive into a little bit more about some advantages and disadvantages of them. Not only looking back at the time of the founding of the country, but today, when you maybe look at the influence of money on elections and the power of incumbency. What are the benefits or negatives of term limits?
So one of the biggest term limits, oh, and just for clarification, is it term limits on the judiciary that you're asking, or is it the legislature?
No, I'm sorry, I'm talking about the legislature at this time.
Okay, so on the legislative, one of the benefits for imposing term limits is accountability, since re-elections respond to the voice of the people, thereby having term limits assume that a person cannot surpass the will of the people to have a person for a certain amount of time. While one of the negatives is that imposing term limits does restrict a politician's ability to make impact as well as to garner experience. And in this case, would adhere to the revolving door policy and perhaps go into lobbying.
We actually have term limits in a few state legislatures. For example, we have it in California. So what we've seen in states once they started implementing term limits, there was a 20 to 30% turnover rate. So normally when re-election rates are up to 80 to 90%, this shows that citizens are using their vote more sincerely because they know that term limits responds to their term limits better respond to their democratic views.
In Federalist 54, Madison discusses the importance of having the House having no term limits, because it's necessary for the representatives to gain experience in federal matters and matters of foreign affairs without being put out too early. And one of the problems with term limits is that if you take away, if you implement term limits, such as in California, this opens up the doors of the legislature to lobbyists, because these legislators are not as experienced and lack the connections of experienced politicians. They in turn turn to lobbyists and adhere to those policies rather than the policies of their constituents.
One of the major points of contention at the convention, and certainly in the great debate in the newspapers thereafter, was about the appropriate size of a republic. Could you say something about this debate? What were the major disagreements, and what side of the debate did you support and why?
Brutus I makes the argument that that the government design couldn't possibly represent the nation because of how large it is and the fact that there would be a lot of diverse views. So that is actually the point that I would stand by personally. And I think to kind of combat that, there needs to be more political representation of ideological minorities, because right now we see that we have a two-party system that takes up most of our political sphere.
I choose to disagree with my colleague. I support Madison's viewpoint in Federalist 10, where he talks about how the necessary need of the large nation expands the view of the public. In doing so, by bringing in more diversity, you prevent the appearance of a like-minded, similarly aligned majority, which could possibly subvert the minority and suppress them in the legislature.
I like to take the perspective. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, I was going to say, I would like to take the perspective in between my two colleagues. I would like to form a more moderate position in that Federalist 10, Madison was correct in his assumption of factions and interests as a form of checks and balance, but so is Brutus in his argument that too much interest would create a sense of majority tyranny. And in that case, that's why federalism exists, to counterbalance such a system.
Maybe a good follow-up question is the size of the republic in actual spatial size, but also population size has expanded exponentially since the time of the founding. With that in mind, would you support a policy like increasing the size of Congress or the House of Representatives?
It was Madison's viewpoint in Federalist 54 that the House should continue to expand as the population increases. In Federalist 54, he talks about how the House of Representatives was always built to be sort of the true voice of the people, and in turn, it should be expanded. However, of course, with the Reapportionment Act of 1929, it has not expanded beyond 435 seats, but I believe we should change that policy.
Not only is overall representation a problem that we see in the current apportionment of the House, but there's also a difference in how certain districts experience representation. For example, in California, there's like a 1 to 900,000 ratio, whereas in smaller states like Wyoming, there's like a 1 to 700, approximately 700,000 ratio. So to equalize that ratio, an apportionment of the House would be needed, and a data journalist from the Time magazine proposed 930 members in the House to kind of remedy that.
And this is actually a point that some of the anti-federalists agreed with, such as Federal Farmer 2 and 3, in which they discussed that the current the size of the House at the time was far too small to represent all known interests within the colonies. And that point extends today, because to an extent, it still holds true today, in that not all interests are properly represented in the House or in Congress itself.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me follow up on one thing I just heard. So what are some of the real implications of that gap, that ratio between urban, essentially, and rural representation? And is that a feature or a bug of what the founders set up? Is it useful, or should it be something we should change?
The founders definitely had in mind this interest for balancing the interests of rural and urban. For example, one of the debates was, sorry, can I finish my thought.
Yes, yeah, please do. Thank you.
Was between large states and small states, which kind of represents that geographic divide that we're talking about right now.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and give you guys a little bit of feedback. So I will start. I think you did a really nice job of sort of taking us through the major issues at the Constitutional Convention, and you weaved into that discussion not only direct citation to a number of primary source documents from the period, but also your own perspectives on whether or not those institutions ought to be changed today. So I thought it had a really, really nice flow to it. And you did a nice job of answering all of our questions. Again, similar to how you began your testimony, consistently weaving in citations to primary source documents and bringing in not only issues that were brought up at the convention, but your own perspectives on how things ought to be today. So congratulations on a job well done. I'll now introduce or ask my other judges to go ahead and share some feedback as well.
You did a great job, opening remarks, as well as the Q&A. I really like that all of you seem to have something important to say, and we're all taking that opportunity to do so. And I really enjoyed hearing the case study, the California politics. Well, we've tried it here. This is what it looked like. This is how we can react to that. I found that to be informative. And I also like that you were willing to disagree with one another. That shows critical thinking, and I appreciate that.
I'd agree. I like that California example as well. And I think it's a sign of the strength of your material when you have something useful like that, and you don't even need to put it in your main presentation. You can even use it on rebuttal. So that was strong. I was surprised and pleased at your response about term limits. I hadn't heard that discussion before, that adding term limits actually increases the power of money in politics by increasing the power of lobbyists. Usually I think the discussion goes the other way. So that was an interesting take. Rhetorically, I think it's always helpful. It turned out you had very strong thoughts as answers. So for instance, Judge Drummond asked a specific question, and the response sometimes was a lot of explanation and then the answer to the question. I would recommend flipping that on its head, giving the yes or no answer or the strong answer, and then giving the explanation, so we don't have to reach in to figure out what your actual answer was. But a strong presentation, I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the feedback.
Thank you.